We're back in chapter 3, and in the last two lessons, we did verse 1, and then we did verses 2 to 5. Okay? So today, we're doing verses 6 to 9. Okay? 6, 7, 8, 9. Obviously, like everything else, it's related to other parts of the chapter, but it has a lot of intrinsic content. So that is to say, content that's just simply inherent to these verses in themselves. The point that he makes here. The final kind of the portions that are spoken of here do roll into the next kind of 5 or so verses, and we'll show that conference in the next lesson, but we're wanting to focus on verses 6 to 9. There'll be a number of other passages which we're going to be cross-referencing, some more specifically, some more in passing. So there will be a bit of moving around, at least 2 major sections of Scripture, some of the chapters of Genesis, and then Romans chapter 4. Okay, so let's read the passage and then go from there.
So where did we say?
We'll be going. We're in this one here today, chapter 3, verses 6 to 9.
Right.
Yep. Chapter 3. Yes, sorry, I should have mentioned that. Chapter 3. Galatians chapter 3. So let's read Galatians chapter 3, verse 6 to 9. Just as Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness, so know that those who are of faith, those are the sons of Abraham. And the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the nations by faith, proclaimed the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, all the nations will be blessed in you. So then, those who are of faith are blessed with Abraham, the believer. Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. So, this is where the Apostle Paul begins his transition into drawing theological connection back to Abraham, at least in a very kind of direct and obvious form. There have been elements that have been touched on that kind of tangentially relate to Abraham, but this is where he specifically begins to outline the theological content of what he's explaining to the Galatians. There's 2 major quotations he makes here from specific sections of Scripture. That's why we're going to cross-reference other places. And I'll point them out as we go through, but they're in verses 6 and 8 respectively. Faith is of course a central component of this, but there are kind of 3 major aspects that are kind of the 3 pillars of this particular subsection, right? Which is obviously Abraham, so there's a personal aspect. Faith, okay, both the nature of faith as well as its application, so it's kind of twofold in that respect, as well as then the relationship or the connection with this idea of the nations, okay, which are mentioned twice in verse 8. So we'll see how all that kind of works together to build our understanding of this passage, right? So, verse 6, just as Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness, so know that those who are of faith, those are the sons of Abraham. So verse 6 and 7. So the first quotation we have here is in verse 6, okay? Specifically the words, believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness, okay? So in other words, just as Abraham, quote, believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness, end quote, so know that those who are of faith, those are the sons of Abraham. Now, the question is, where is he quoting from? So he's quoting from Genesis chapter 15, what for us is Genesis chapter 15, verse 6 specifically. If you turn to Genesis 15, we'll start with one of these major cross-references. Okay? We're going to transition into Romans chapter 4, where he also actually quotes this passage as well. So this is not the first time he's made reference to this. He makes 2 major references to this specific part of Genesis 15. The 2 major ones being Romans chapter 4 and our passage today, which is Galatians 3, right? So, Genesis 15. I'll begin in verse 1 so you can understand what's going on, right? This is when God makes his covenant with, as he was known then, Abram, his original name, before his name was changed by God to Abraham, okay? Which comes up, I believe, in one of our other references, if I'm not mistaken, but either way I can explain that later. So this is earlier on. Abraham's story, of course, begins in chapter 12, and so this is in the earlier portions of the Abrahamic story in Genesis, all right? So let's just begin in verse 1 of Genesis 15. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, Do not fear, Abram, I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great. And Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me as I go on being childless, and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus? So just context, so you understand what's being said here. Abraham is a tribal chieftain, right? A patriarch is why that word gets used, patriarch, right? Meaning from the Latin patris or pater, meaning father, and the Greek archos or archon, meaning ruler. So the ruling father, right? The head of the house, the head of, in this case, not just his clan, but actually his tribe. Okay. If you read through the book of Genesis and as you become more familiar with the story, or if you are familiar with the story, he is called on this great journey across the Mesopotamian world, across the Fertile Crescent, as it's known in the ancient world, to journey from the city of Ur, a very ancient city, of the greater Babylonian, Akkadian region, all the way across to the land which we're familiar with, of course, right? What became the United Kingdom of Israel at that time. He has no son, right? He and his wife Sarah, whose name is also then Sarah, are childless, of course. They're older in age, of course, him being a tribal chieftain and elder. He is effectively a type of king in his respect. He's a petty king. Not petty in the sense of the way we use it as an adjective, petty in the technical sense. He's a chief over a tribe. Okay, he's a nobleman, and he rules over his tribe. That's the entire essence of the point. The heir of his house, the heir of his dynasty, the person who would inherit his chiefdom, was obviously not his own son, because he has none, right? So his next nearest kin is this man named Eleazar of Damascus. So he's explaining this to God, right? That he has no heir, he has no one to continue his legacy on, right? And obviously that becomes one of the central points of the story of Abraham, right? So anyway, continuing on verse 3. And Abram said, since you have given no seed to me, in other words, child, right? Behold, one born in my house is my heir. Then behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, this one will not be your heir, as in reference to this Eleazar, okay? This one will not be your heir, but one who will come forth from your own body, he shall be your heir. So he's promising you will have a son, and that will be the heir, right? And he brought him outside, God brought him, Abram, outside, and said, now look toward the heavens and number the stars, if you are even able to number them. And he said to him, so shall your seed be. Right? In other words, so shall your descendants. Verse 6, which is the main part for us. Then he believed in God, and God counted it to him as righteousness. So that's the quote, right? He counted it to him as righteousness. The wording in Galatians, again, he's quoting that. Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, okay, which is the Greek rendering. So, casts his eyes up, right? Again, he's without child, he has no heir. This is a very bad position to be in as a tribal chieftain, as a king, as an emperor, as any kind of leader in those positions. You have no one to whom to pass the throne onto, in this case his chiefdom. That spells bad news in every respect. It spells bad news not only for you personally, of course, with no one to continue your name on, no one to continue your own family on, but it spells often at times pragmatic difficulties at best, sometimes even disasters at worst, political instability, the potentiality for conflict, for treason, for civil war in regards to the succession, right? All kinds of things that can go wrong. However, God promises him that he will have a son despite its seeming improbability, or at least in a certain point, eventually when they get that old, impossibility. And in fact, not only that, your descendants, so more than just his immediate son, but your descendants from that point, they will be as innumerable as the stars in the heavens. Okay? This is obviously an incredible promise, but he believes God. That's the fundamental point that's being made here, right? When God says this to him, he doesn't doubt it and he doesn't disbelieve. He in fact believes. He has trust, right? We've explained before the notion of what the word faith means, okay? Contra modern kind of cynicism, especially in regards to atheism or secularism, that faith is merely this blind emotional crutch that mankind holds onto. In a very Nietzschean kind of perspective, faith is in its essence and core synonymous with trust. Okay, that's where we get the word confidence from, right? Confide, with faith. Faith is trust, and trust is faith. They are exactly the same word. The same Greek word is used to translate both those words in English. You trust things for good reasons. Sometimes you can trust things for bad reasons. So you can misplace your trust, of course, right? You can misplace your faith, to use those terms synonymously. But the notion of faith is inherently identical to trust. You're trusting in XYZ thing, right? In this case, you're trusting that when God says something, that he's actually telling the truth, which I think is a fair bet. In this case, this, again, as Moses is providing the commentary here in verse 6, then he, Abraham, believed God, and God counted it to him as righteousness. Okay? He had faith. His righteousness didn't come by his works of the law. The Mosaic law hadn't been written. Now, the law of God still existed. All 10 of the commandments predate Moses, right? That's why Cain, of course, is exiled for the murder of Abel, right? But in this particular case, his faith, his trust in God's promise is what was counted to him as righteousness, right? So the notion of faith being the fundamental or integral part of the covenant of God is not something that's limited to the New Testament. Okay, that's a common misconception in our time, that the Old Covenant, or not even just the Old Covenant, anything in the Old Testament, even beyond the days of Moses, prior to, that's all the old stuff where you did animal sacrifices and these weird rituals, right? And had odd laws like not eating certain types of seafood or not wearing mixed cloth and other such things. And then in the New Testament, we abandon all that and do this thing called faith, and we just kind of all sit around and have this abstract concept, right? It's not ever what it was, right? What Paul's point in Galatians is the exact same point that Moses himself is providing commentary on in verse 6. Do you understand, of Genesis 15, right? Abraham has it all the time. Abraham believed in God, and God counted it to him as righteousness. Faith, righteousness. Not works of the law, because that's much of his later point, of course, in the rest of Galatians. We'll get into that when we get to it, obviously. But we are justified before God. We're made right with God in the exact same way that Abraham was, and that is by faith. And it always has been, right? As we've been going through Deuteronomy in our expository series in sermons on Sunday, right, during the worship services, we've seen over and over again the generation in the wilderness, from like the generation of the Exodus, yeah? And that generation is rejected by God because they reject him, right? God doesn't abandon them, they abandon him. They violate the covenant, they reject, they apostatize, they rebel, and that's how the cookie crumbles. And then the book of Deuteronomy is written to their children, encouraging them and warning them not to go the way of their fathers, right? Who rejected God and were destroyed for it, okay? The ancestral component's there, the bloodline's there, right? But that's not the ultimate delineator, right? That's but the vehicle, right? For the ultimate purpose, not even of the people of the bloodline, but for the ultimate person of the bloodline, who is Christ, right? Jesus, right? The seed that's specifically and ultimately in reference is Jesus himself, right? Via a certain line, okay? Integral to the whole notion of the incarnation, of God taking on human flesh, right, taking on human form, etc., etc. But faith is the very thing that has always justified anyone before God, right? again, keeping in mind one of those other synonymous words, like we're talking about with faith and trust, is justice and righteousness. They're the exact same thing. We just have two different English words for them. We use them in different contexts these days, but historically speaking, coming out of ancient languages, they're the same thing. Justice is righteousness, righteousness is justice. Yeah. So when I'm using these terms, like faith, you think trust. When I'm saying justice, you think righteousness, or vice versa, right? They're all together. The generation in the wilderness rejects God, right? The generation who come of the Exodus rejects God en masse, right? Not literally all of them, because you have faithful ones like Joshua and Caleb and many of the others, right? So it's not every one of them, but en masse, we say that generation rejected God, because the vast majority of them did. Right? The generation after, though, was faithful under the leadership of one of the few people, a young man at that time, who was faithful to God, who was Joshua, of course, right? And so he raises up the young man who was faithful even despite the fact that his elders and superiors were not, right, en masse. And then he uses him to lead the rest of his generation, the children and the grandchildren, some even by that point, right? That's always been the case, all the way through, right? You get a number of faithful generations in Joshua's time and kind of immediately after. It then tends to fall off a cliff during the book of Judges, and the time of the Judges. But you also still have faithful figures like Gideon and others, okay? And various others along those times. And then there's a massive reformation or revival in faithfulness in the time of David, and it lasts to the days of Solomon and then tails off again. Like it's back and forth, right? And so it's not like this notion that all these people that you ever read of in the Old Testament are all in the proverbial camp. They're not. In fact, a lot of them, and in fact, actually what Jesus says, the majority of them are not. Okay? They reject, they rebel. And that's why he condemns Jerusalem during the Passion Week. Right? Woe, woe to Jerusalem, the city that murders the prophets that are sent to it. From your head I will demand all the righteous blood from Abel to Zechariah. Okay? Abraham was justified before God, in other words, made righteous, okay, made right with God by faith. Again, keeping in mind this is all prior to any of the major things. This is prior to him arriving in Hebron or in the land of Israel, land of Palestine. This is prior to him having the kind of climactic event up on the mount with his son Isaac, right, that you read of. This is prior to all these things. He's already from the get-go in one of not literally the first, but one of the first interactions that he's having, one of the early interactions, I should say, that he's having with God, where the covenant is officially established with him, right, from God to him. God promises to do X, Y, Z as part of that covenant. He was very familiar with covenants, of course, as a tribal chieftain. Again, we've talked a bit about covenants in our time in Deuteronomy, about how that works with kingdoms and vassal states and other such things, different tribes. He believes that God does what is right and that he's telling the truth. That's faith.
God's asking you to believe in something that was ultimately going to be like miraculous, really.
Ultimately, yes. He and his old wife are going to have a child at an age that they shouldn't be able to have children, right? Yeah. And it's not meant to happen every other Tuesday, right? But that's kind of the definition of why something is miraculous. And again, miraculous things are by nature rare, right? We call them supernatural by virtue of the fact that they're not against nature per se. They are against the nature. Pardon the pun. The nature of supernatural things is that they are against, or a better word, they are peculiar and unusual as compared to the natural way of things. Okay. By way of analogy or comparison, when the Exodus thing, as I mentioned earlier, occurs, it's not as if in the story, if you ever actually go and read it specifically and focus on the details, like kind of just slow down and read the details, that the Israelites turn up on the beachhead and then all of a sudden the water just starts moving for inexplicable reasons. All right? Moses, obviously who's an eyewitness, explains that the great east wind, right? The earth has 4 major wind patterns, right, that go across the globe. Of course, wind at all kinds of levels, but the major wind patterns. And a great wind blew from the east, from the far side of the Red Sea, and separated the waters. Right? So something physical separated the waters. We've all seen how wind moves water, right? Okay. So it's supernatural in the fact that normally large wind currents and patterns do not move entire bodies of, not oceanic water in that case, but the water of full-blown seas. Okay, right? That in those parts of the Red Sea are, very deep, anywhere between 90 to 200 meters deep, right? And beyond. That doesn't normally happen, right? But wind moving water does. And that's what God does. He uses the wind to separate the water so that they walk upon the seabed, the seafloor, right? So it's supernatural, but through natural means. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. Again, it's not like, they had a child, refer going back to this point, as I said by way of analogy. You will have a child and you'll go out, for lunch one day, and then you'll come back and you'll find a baby that just kind of pops out of the ether into a crib. It's not, no, you will get pregnant, right? So it's natural means, right? So that's the notion of supernatural, right? It's natural, it's God utilizing the material world, the world he's created, in ways that it doesn't normally function. It's not about ways that it can't function, it's just ways that it normally doesn't function, right? There's all kinds of accounts of women far past menopause who have, for various different, very rare and exceptional reasons, fallen pregnant at 60, 70, 80. Like there are examples of those things, right? Exceptionally rare, right? Even at the age in which menopause, broadly speaking, occurs, there are at times natural spikes in fertility during that time period, right? The point being is that supernatural things happen by virtue or by way of God utilizing the material world in ways that are unusual, not normal. That's why we call it supernatural, not anti-natural, right? Super in this context, in the technical sense philosophically, means above, right? An enhancement of, right? Supernatural, okay? That's the notion of it. That's the nature, pardon the pun, of it, right? So he believes, right? He trusts, that is to say, that God is not a liar. Again, a safe bet. As improbable as this seems to him, even potentially impossible, right? If some other human being was telling him this just off the cuff, it makes no sense for him to trust anything like that, right? Because what authority, let alone power, do you have to bring that into reality, right? But in this case, there's only one being whom you would ever reasonably believe or trust is actually going to pull something like this off, and it might as well be the one who created every atom in the universe, right? So he believes in God, and God counted it to him as righteousness. That's the quote, okay? So there's a couple of things that are going on here to tie us back to Genesis, back to Galatians, just before we move on to the other major portion, which is Romans 4, right? Where the Apostle Paul utilizes this passage. By virtue of him quoting this, of course, he's bringing to memory the whole story of Abraham, right? It's no different than, if someone says, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo? You're inherently drawing to mind Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. Do you know what I mean? Or various other sections of Shakespearean literature by virtue of quote. You can quote famous sections of a movie, and you're bringing to mind a particular scene in a movie, for example, right? You're drawing it by way of comparison, right? We do that all the time. It's very, very common, especially today in the age of the internet and short form messaging and tweets limited to a certain amount of characters and memes and other such things, right? It's short form kind of referencing is, I suppose, yeah, exactly, yeah, we make reference to the Titanic, right? There's all kinds of things, you know what I mean? And so that's no different in the ancient world. People have done that forever, right? We do that today, they did that back then, it's just a normal thing. When Christ quotes the incipit, i.e. the opening of Psalm 22, he is quoting, in essence, the whole psalm. He's bringing to mind the whole psalm when he says on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Right? The psalm, in reference, Psalm 22 is about the death of the Messiah, ultimately his crucifixion. Right? So in this case, when Paul is quoting from Genesis 15, verse 6, he's bringing to memory the promise that God made to Abraham, not just literally the one single sentence that Moses wrote about it. Does that make sense? Okay. So it's not just it is that kernel. Like, so it is the base element, but it's also the structure that's built up on the base element. Yeah. By quoting the verse, he's obviously drawing specific attention to the verse, but by extension, the context in which the verse finds itself. Okay. So it's not just merely that Abraham trusted God and that was counted him as righteousness. So he's making obviously a point about what we'd call soteriology, in other words, salvation, right? The understanding, the theology of salvation, of redemption. But more broadly, he's making a point about the promise made to Abraham and its fulfillment, right? They're living through the beginning of its fulfillment. Well, it's at least in a primary sense. The beginning of its fulfillment. Technically speaking, it had begun earlier than that, because there are examples in the Old Testament. But in a meaningful sense, the new covenant is the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham. That is what its essence is. So, that other major portion I was talking about is Romans chapter 4. So turn over there with me to Romans 4, right? So back in the New Testament. And you flick forward to Romans 4. If we were doing this specifically, we would need to look at a lot more contextual details to understand some of the particulars. We don't need them here in reference to what we're looking at. So we're going to begin in verse 9 of Romans chapter 4 and go through to verse 18, which covers the particular portion of what we're wanting to actually reference back to in regards to Galatians, okay? So in Romans, he has been, in the first 3 chapters, giving an explanation of evil and wickedness and sin and the inherent corruption of the human condition, our enslavement to the curse of sin, of original sin, and how this has plagued mankind since the beginning. He then transitions through chapters 4 and 5 in a discussion of righteousness, what it is, how it is achieved, etc., right? But anyway, this is the context which defines itself. So, verse 9, he does a similar thing in this section to what he's doing in Galatians 3, which is using Abraham to explain the point he's making. Right? So verse 9 of Romans 4. Therefore, is this blessing, referring to the blessing of God, right, salvation, which is what he's been talking about in the first 8 verses. Therefore, is this blessing on the circumcised or on the uncircumcised also? So in other words, on the Jews or on those who are from among the nations as well? Rhetorical question. For we say, quote, faith was counted to Abraham as righteousness. So that's the quote again, okay, that we saw in Genesis 15 verse 6, okay? So that's why we're linking these passages together. He's quoted it in Galatians 3, he then quotes it again here in Romans 4. How then, based on the fact that Abraham was justified by faith, not even the circumcision itself, nor blood, right? How then was it counted? Question mark. While he was circumcised or uncircumcised? Well, the answer is prior to, right? Like I said to you, this is early on in the days of Abraham, right? The various other covenant elements that come along in the story later on haven't happened yet. It's not that they're not important, they are. They haven't happened yet. So he's justified by faith prior to any of the ritual elements. Are you following me? Yep. It's a vital detail, okay? Because the entire essence of the argument by various different peoples, but including particularly Paul's own countrymen during the first century, is, I suppose in simple terms, we're the chosen people because we're descendants of Abraham. Ancestrally, that is, genetically, right? Biologically.
And we're circumcised.
And we're circumcised, right? And that's the proof, okay? He's then writing to Christians in Rome, which is a mixture of ethnic Jew and ethnic Roman, of course, right? There was a major Jewish diaspora in Rome, of course, in these days, during the early days of the empire. But this is the fundamental question, right? How is that faith counted to Abraham as righteousness? Was it while he was circumcised, in other words, while he'd done the ritual element of the old covenant, or was it prior to that? In other words, uncircumcised. Well, he says so in the end of verse 10, not while circumcised, but rather while uncircumcised. Yeah? And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of faith, which he had while uncircumcised. So in other words, he's saying he had the faith prior to, and the covenant sign was the seal of that. That's no different in the New Testament. It's just that the mode has changed, right? Correct. Okay. That's a much more complex discussion, right? But this is one of these fundamental points here, which also then he makes elsewhere. He mainly actually makes this point, the Apostle Paul, in Colossians chapter 2, where he talks about this whole notion again. Go ahead.
So just to clarify, so basically what's being said is that Abraham, before all the ritual elements of
the covenant,
the covenant, he was right with God before that because of
correct because of faith. Because he trusted God.
Because he trusted God. So nothing else, whether he'd been circumcised, whether he was what.
Those are not the specific things which made him righteous. As he says here, they're a seal of it. Now, again, we're not focusing specifically on the nature of the sacraments. If we did, that would be a different lesson to explain what these means. But if you, for example, our own doctrinal statement here explains that baptism is the seal is the sign of our union, of our being made right with God, and the seal of the Holy Spirit. I'll have to find the exact wording specifically if I can get it up off the top of my head, so I'm not having to paraphrase. I'm almost quoting, but I will get it up specifically. And again, this is standard biblical language which Christians have believed since time immemorial. The debate and discussion has usually been about how many sacraments there are. That's usually been what the debate was coming out of the medieval period. But more specifically is also the nature, is what that specifically means. But the fact that it is a thing has never really been debated, except by those who just totally reject the notion of the sacraments. Yes, so our wording specifically, we believe that baptism is one of the two sacraments, or we use ordinances here, but again, they're synonymous, ordinance, sacrament, same thing. We believe that the baptism is one of the two ordinances / sacraments of the church. It is a sign of one's fellowship, emphasis on the word sign, a sign of one's fellowship with Christ, and a seal of, by means of one's union with him in his death, burial, and resurrection, right? Similar kind of wording is then used in regards to Holy Communion, right? This ordinance / sacrament is to be celebrated with the elements of bread and wine by all the saints of Christ unto the end of the age. It commemorates and proclaims his substitutionary atonement, with the bread and wine being a sign and seal, right? So same two operative words, right? Of our partaking in the accomplished sacrifice, right? So it's a sign, the outward sign of the inward reality is usually how we phrase it.
So those two things those two things are not the same at, I don't want to say something wrong, but...
No, go ahead.
So you have, faith comes first, and then you're right with God once you have faith, and these things come after it to seal and to show an outward sign. Is that kind of... Yeah,
they're connected to it, so they're inextricably linked, right?
Yeah.
And again...
But you do these two things alone, that does not make you necessary. It's the faith element that makes you right with God.
Doing them without faith is pointless, right?
Yeah.
The question has always been, the debate has been about the nature of faith, when faith comes, etc. That's a much more complex subject that again would need its own lesson to go through the particulars on, especially concerning the amount of assumptions that lie around that subject. But that's, like I said, we'd need a different lesson to do that. But that's the nature of them. They're still necessary. So this is the thing, though. They're necessary.
But
they're 100% necessary.
They're kind, so it's not they're. I guess what I'm trying to say is, by people get, like they're equally as important as one another. Would that be correct?
100%, yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, you would never. I don't know. pick some weird example like get baptized and never take communion or something.
Yeah.
That would never, no. So historically, baptism, holy baptism is referred to as the initiatory rite, R-I-T-E, of the church, and then Holy Communion is referred to as the continuing rite, right? And the names are pretty self-evident as to what that means.
Yeah.
Initiatory, it's baptism that initiates you into the kingdom of God, and it is, and then the sacrament of Holy Communion is the continuing rite. In other words, the continuing sign of your citizenship, of your allegiance unto, of your partaking in, etc., right? And so there's real, again, that kind of language is more than just, it's not just merely like we make point about its commemoration, but it's not merely that, right? It's not just so for example, when you do baptism or communion, it's not just this thing, this old custom you do to kind of have an abstract memory in the 6 inches between your ears of this thing that happened 2,000 years ago called the Last Supper, right, or the crucifixion, right? So it's not this abstract, that's an extremely modernist, rationalist, post-enlightenment kind of idea where it all just becomes abstract up here, right? And there's no spiritual element to it at all, right? Way too many churches hold that view, and it's nowhere to be found in scripture or church history, unfortunately. There is real spiritual action going on. So again, when God commands him to undergo that rite, that ritual, the old covenant equivalent of what is baptism, right? That is the sign of his sealing in the covenant, of him being sealed, right? So a seal, think like literally a seal. It's the mark, in this case a very visible and obvious one, that comes at a cost that involves pain and sacrifice, right? So there's a cost to it, okay? Not just physically, but elsewise. There is a price that's paid, there's blood that's spilt, there's flesh that's been cut, which is all symbolizing the need for sacrifice in the first place, right? That's part of the point. It seals him, it's the seal, it's like God's signet ring almost, that this man, this person is in the covenant, right? In covenant with me. This is the sign. It's no different than someone, an army wearing, carrying its flag into battle, right? They're flying under the banner of their king and they're on that team, okay, to put it in colloquial terms. Same thing, it's just the mode then shifts for a whole host of reasons that Paul explains elsewhere in other apostles. As to the purpose, baptism is where we are spiritually cleansed, right? So again, the faith, it's not disconnected from that, but there is a precedence to it, if that makes sense. And it's not as if we are saved because we did the baptism. Mm-hmm. It's the means by which God uses to spiritually cleanse us, right? Because the Apostle Peter says that we're saved through the waters, just as Noah and his family were saved through the waters of the flood. Okay, we did a sermon on this back when both of you were baptized, right? That you'd be able to go back and listen to again if you wanted to. And so the spiritual cleansing, again, doesn't occur through the water, physical material water. So it's not the material water that spiritually cleanses you, because material things don't have that impact spiritually. It's something spiritual. Like I was talking about earlier, and again, we're on a tangent, but that's fine. It's a good tangent to go on. Seeing as it ties to this notion of faith anyway. The spiritual and the material elements, this is kind of what I was talking about with regards to the actual parting of the Red Sea, right? There is something spiritual going on, right? God is miraculously saving these Israelites as they're fleeing at 100 miles an hour from the Egyptian army who's hot on their heels, right? But he uses material means. He sends the wind to part the waters and they walk across, right? And then as the Egyptian army foolishly chases them in, right, he gets them. So something beyond just the pure everyday material world is going on, yet it's all through and via the material world. Do you know what I mean? Because we're not Gnostics and we don't radically separate the material and spiritual worlds, right? Because they're actually united, right? Not to be confused, right? There's a difference, but they're united together, right? Just like in Christ, the material and the spiritual, in other words, the human and the divine, are perfectly united without being mixed together. Right? There's a consistency to all these things philosophically. They're all completely consistent with one another. So as through circumcision in the Old Covenant, baptism in the New Covenant, it's equivalent, right? The Apostle Peter's point in his epistle is we're saved through the water, not by a washing of dirt from the body, so in other words, like the physical, washing of the water, but by an appeal unto heaven for a good conscience. And again, I preached on that, I explained what all that meant, right? But in other words, as an appeal to heaven, right? Faith, okay? Specifically actually from the Holy Spirit himself. But again, we talked about that in that sermon. And so through the water, the material means, God spiritually cleanses us. Not physically, because that's irrelevant. And not because the physical cleanses us spiritually. He spiritually cleanses us in and through the action of the material, in this case, going into the water. Right? So like when are we spiritually cleansed by God? Well, through the waters of baptism. That's why if you don't get baptized, the notion what are you doing here? Right? You're missing a vital component that God has specifically prescribed for these purposes. Same as with communion, ongoing, right? In fact, did I not make this point to you, Lisa, on Sunday when you asked me about something? I think it was you, maybe I made that point, or about, I can't remember who I was making it to, about the spiritual detriment that just about every Christian had, including ours here, after going 6 months without communion.
Yes.
Was that you I was talking to? Yeah. You shut down churches for 6 months, you ban people from partaking in the sacrament of Holy Communion, and everyone's life was worse off, right? Not in some juju sense, I'm talking about like spiritually, right? Everyone was every single person was in a worse place, here and every other of my fellow clergymen that I've literally ever talked to, ever, right? Because we're not just material beings, right? God administers his grace not through weird abstract means. Again, we have these very weird Gnostic views on things, not literally Gnostic, but semi kind of Gnostic light, kind of quasi-Gnostic views, right? And it's all, again, there's a whole host of reasons why it's the case. It's because of the Enlightenment, it's because of rationalism, it's because of how much atheism as a worldview has seeped into our views on things. But we think that God administers his grace just through some completely unidentifiable means out there in the ether somewhere, right? We talk about our ongoing sanctification, right? Being conformed into the image of Christ, being made more like him. And then when actually asked how does that happen, we have no clue, because we disconnect ourselves from history, we don't learn from the scriptures, we don't learn how people understood this historically, right? No, it's through communion. That's how. It's not through some unidentifiable abstract means, right? Because this is not a secret esoteric cult that we're in, okay? Things are clear, things are identifiable, things are in the open, right? The truth is transparent, right? It's not hidden, it's not opaque. It's through an identifiable means that everyone can point to and go, this is how it's done. Do you understand what I mean? Right? Because that's how truth operates. It's not some secret thing that you have to have some high convoluted philosophical training to understand. And that's coming from someone who has a high convoluted philosophical training, right? This is not how this works. We grow through the grace of God. How is the grace of God administered? Through communion. That's how. Okay? Through communion. We are raised into the heavens, as the Apostle Paul describes, and as early church fathers now describe, right? The reformers as well. And we commune with him, right? And we partake of the blessings that Christ has won and achieved for us, etc., right? But anyway, whole other lesson. Coming back to this particular section, right? Back in chapter 4 of Romans, right? Because we want to see what this is doing for us, right? Again, was it whilst he was circumcised or uncircumcised that he was counted as righteous in verse 10? Well, not while he was circumcised, but rather uncircumcised. Verse 11, and he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of faith. Sign, seal. That's exactly why Christians use that terminology. That's why our doctrinal statement uses that terminology. And when churches abandon that doctrinal statement, like these kinds of words, you're departing from Scripture. Another issue altogether. It's a seal of the righteousness. It confirms it, right? It doesn't create it, but it confirms it. Hence the notion of seal, right? Which he had while uncircumcised, so that he might be the father of all who believe without being circumcised, so that that righteousness might be counted to them. Okay, I'm going to read verse 11 again so you understand exactly what's being said. Abraham received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of faith, which he had whilst uncircumcised, in other words, prior to, so that he might be the father, the ancestor, the patriarch, of all who believe without being circumcised. In other words, all the people of the various nations, the Greeks, the Celts, the Romans, the Armenians, the Assyrians, the Egyptians, right, etc., etc., etc. All the people who were not ethnically Jewish. Okay? So all this, can consider what's going on now if you just zoom out before I even continue on. 2,000 years prior to him, as in Paul, the Apostle Paul, writing this, that plan is already set in motion, right? God specifically conducts it that way in chapter 15, verse 6, as we were reading earlier, right? Where he makes the covenant with Abraham, then called Abram. His faith, Abram trusts God, and that faith is counted to him as righteousness. Of course, the Apostle Paul goes on to explain that even faith itself is a gift, so you can't even boast in the fact that you have the faith in the first place, right? The faith itself is described as actually being a gift from God through his grace, especially in Ephesians 2. But that's another subject. And that was all for the purpose of the fact that God was going to redeem all the nations. It was never only going to be about one nation. It was going to be about that nation, but not only that nation. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Right? Because obviously, keeping in mind all the disciples themselves are from that one nation, right? The Jews. So it's not like it's to the exclusion of them per se, right? It's them plus. Yeah. So we get into this word, and again, we'll come back to that word Gentile when we get back to Galatians 3, right? Because there's a particular point to make there as well. But either way, verse 12, and the father of circumcision to those who not only are of the circumcision, but who also follow in the steps of the faith of our father Abraham, which he had whilst uncircumcised. So both circumcised and uncircumcised. In other words, what that means in colloquial terms, Jews and Greeks. Which is exactly the word that he ends up using by the time we get to the end of Galatians 3. Okay? So what he's saying here into the Romans, keeping in mind he writes the letter to the Galatians about a decade, probably actually a little bit more than a decade, nearly 12 years prior to him writing Romans, right? So this is him writing after he's written the stuff to the Galatians, right? So he's repeating the point really actually here. He's making an expanded point here that he made in the passage we're looking at in Galatians. Does that make sense? Verse 13, I just want to keep going because it opens this up for us. For the promise to Abraham, or to his seed, his descendants, that he would be heir of the world, not just one place, the world, was not through the law, i.e. of Moses, but through the righteousness of faith. Okay? Not through the law, but through faith. For if those who are of the law are heirs, faith has been made empty and the promise has been abolished. In other words, it's rendered futile at that point. It's rendered useless, because if it's through upkeeping of all the law of God, the faith element doesn't alter the fact that you've violated the law. This is a fundamental component, even just very briefly, of the notion of justice, right? It's the direct repudiation of the Oriental view of good and evil, right? Occidental or Western civilization has a completely different conceptualization and understanding of good and evil than the Orient, right? The East, right? Indian, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, etc., Indochina, blah, blah. Who has a karmic or broadly karmic view, right? The notion of yin and yang when you get further over into the Far East, okay? Two equal but opposing forces, right? That work on a sense of scales, right? In one respect. But in this particular aspect, because the scales is really a Western concept, rather than, in the case of the East, of the various Oriental lands, you have this notion of essentially a zero-sum game. Which has more than the other? Which one outperforms or outweighs the other, right? So in the karmic sense, especially when you're talking about the various cultures and societies and civilizations that have sprung forth out of ancient India and the Indus Valley civilization, Buddhism being an archetypical example of this kind of concept, of course, with karmic cycles and other such things. If there is more good than there is bad or evil, right, you are karmically positive, okay? There's a comparative aspect to it. The understanding in Western civilization, even beyond Christian, but particularly in Christian, of course, being foundational to Western civilization, it doesn't operate that way. It operates what you would call on a per se level, right? Or even ipso facto level, which is that one evil act stands in its own right and doesn't somehow magically get outweighed by the amount of good that one does, right? However you're defining that doesn't really matter, but just at least in the broad categories, right? And we understand this, even those who have this, you know, there's obviously in the last kind of 100 years or so, there's been a rise in kind of popular fascination with Oriental things and things of the East, and particularly in regards to New Age religion and, you know, everything from more cultic aspects of New Age religions all the way down to soccer mums doing yoga in the park on a Friday morning or whatever. Buddha garden gnomes and whatever. Yeah, blah, blah, blah. The problem is that none of them really actually genuinely believe that. Well, there is an element of belief. It's not that they don't believe it at all. It's just they don't really believe that. Because if someone murdered a family member, they'd be crying out for justice. And the first thought that would not pop into their head is, I wonder if that person is karmically positive at this particular time.
Yeah.
Do you understand what I mean? They wouldn't be, none of that would be their consideration, right? For very obvious reasons, right? Because they instinctually know they can't outrun the natural instinct, nor can they outrun thousands of years of ancestry in Western civilization, which has built this concept for good reason, because that's exactly how this works, right? Once the evil is done, right? In other words, the absence of good, it can't be expunged by doing other good, right? Because all those things are additional good acts. They don't deal with this evil act, right? Evil itself being the absence of good. Again, that's another fundamental difference between a Western and an Eastern understanding of the nature of good and evil, but that's another subject. Because for the very simple reason that we're not time travelers. Right? That evil act is in a philosophical sense, it's ingrained in the very fabric of time. Right? Once we move forward in time, literally in this sense, I know it sounds like deeply philosophical, but being smart, this is philosophical. You can't go back and deal with that thing. Right? It's happened. It happened, and you can make elements of restitution for it in the future. Right? Perhaps in a restorative sense, right? Sometimes in a judicial, again, although that depends on what it means, but not in a legal sense, not in a philosophical sense, right? You can't undo the fact, to use the really obvious example of murder that I used earlier, that you murdered someone. Okay? You can pay the debt to the society, you can be cleansed by God, right? You still murdered someone. Now, beyond death, that is expunged. In fact, it's actually not expunged only beyond death. It's expunged there and now, right, by virtue of that. But again, that's only by the intervention of God. Without that, the human ability to expunge that, to cover that, to deal with that is zilch. No ability. That's the problem, right? And so our justice system is literally designed on that very concept, right? Elements of your behavior might impact sentencing to one degree or another, although that depends even then on the crime. The more serious the crime, the less that impact is going to have, right, on sentencing. But either way, your charitable givings the previous financial year are not going to impact whether or not you're going to get found guilty for homicide.
And even if you're like here in prison, like I remember years ago, and I can't remember his name, there was a man on death row in America who committed, I think, at least one murder anyway, when he was young. And he when he was in prison, he was on death row for decades in the end. But he changed. He found God. He ended up doing great work with kids, trying to get them out of gangs, which is what he was in. He did amazing work, but he was still ultimately executed.
Yeah.
So because that was his sentence, but it didn't negate him doing all that good. Didn't negate the bad he'd done, but at the same time, the bad did not wipe out the good that he had done either.
Yeah, vice versa. Yeah, it goes both ways.
It kind of.
Yeah. Even to round up this point, I mean, like Jeffrey Dahmer is a famous example. So Jeffrey Dahmer, active back in the 80s and the early 90s, killed at least 17 men ranging from basically 14 to 30, 32 years old. I won't belabor you with how he did it, but either way, serial killing, rape, cannibalism. One of America's most prolific serial killers, and certainly probably it's the most violent. Rather clearly converts to the faith in prison, right? Very, very clearly, in fact, actually. Is existentially ridden with the guilt of what he's done to the point that it's basically a burden on his life. But he lived in a state without he was in prison in a state and charged and imprisoned in a state without the death penalty in Milwaukee, and so all he was given was umpteenth centuries of life in prison. I want to go back and look at how long. It's not that long. I think it's a little bit less than 12 months after his conversion that he gets killed in prison. Now, that might seem like a tragic end to the story. It's not really a tragic end. For a man at this point so burdened by the weight of what he had done, who was drowning in such existential guilt, right, and struggling as a new Christian to overcome that guilt, it takes a profound understanding to realise that that's an act of mercy on God's part, right? It takes a lot of empathy and depth to realise that.
How did he do it?
He was stabbed in prison. He was killed by fellow inmates.
Okay.
Right. Yep.
I think he wanted to die.
Yes. In many respects, he did, and he struggled again because he was a sociopath or psychopath prior to that. Very clearly, again, he had no meaningful sentiment or care at all for the notion of right and wrong. In fact, upon his conversion, he explicitly states that it was because he was an atheist that he felt totally fine with doing it, because what are the consequences going to be? If I can get away with it, right, the worst thing that happens is I get put in prison. But who cares? Because it's the modern prison system, and you can flourish in modern prison systems. Plenty of people do if they know how to work that system. In fact, many people's lives are an upgrade when they get put in prison compared to what they were living in. And so he attributes his utter consumption of evil to his atheism directly. Atheists in the 90s and the 2000s.
How did he convert? Like, how did that come about?
His father was a Christian.
Oh, okay.
And during his youth, he utterly rejected it. He was an atheist, like I said, and basically adopted the very Nietzschean perspective of God is dead and we have killed him. And so now what? Well, anything we want, right? Nietzsche lamented that fact. It's more like a form of sadism almost, almost the perspective of the libertines of revolutionary France and figures like Marquis de Sade, who viewed it as there is no God above us. We can literally do what, it's the essence of Satanism, do what thou wilt. Do what you want. Right? There is no masters, no masters, no lords. Right?
We have worship is so built within us. It's in our DNA to worship something, and what people don't see when they say these things, they're worshipping themselves. They're making themselves
auto worship,
a god, or
the ego, the self,
So they worship you. We all,
Yep. So that's how that goes. Yeah. Anyway, his father gives him a Bible while he's in there. Prisoners tend to have a fair bit of time on their hands, and God saves him.
Wow.
It's that simple. He'd been ministered to by the Christian chaplain who was working in that particular prison, and ta-da. But yeah, again, a new Christian, flooded with the guilt of everything he'd done. But this is the point I'm trying to make, just so I can round up and get back to this. The two things are achieved in that, in the death of Jeffrey Dahmer, which, like I said, requires a fair bit of depth and introspection and empathy to realise. One, a tough mercy is given to him, right? Tough for us to comprehend, but a mercy ultimately, right? Alleviating him from his own kind of spiritual, psychological suffering, right? But two, justice. Because Dahmer lived in a state without the death penalty. And there is only one penalty for homicide, and that is death. It always has been. Again, human culture has always understood this. Murders were always put to death, because he who sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. Genesis 9. When a life is taken, life must be taken, right? The justice, the cosmic justice of the universe demands it, right? The natural order that God has made, right? Bloodshed requires bloodshed.
Even if it's manslaughter or self-defence?
Different kettle of fish. I'm talking about homicide here,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Right, so I'm talking about, we're talking about what we call, that's why we make that distinction as well.
Yeah.
Right, so Christian culture, Christian civilization makes a distinction between...
Isn't there something about manslayer or something in the...
Yep, so yeah,
talks about this place?
very different subject, yeah, so cities of refuge, yeah, we can talk about that after the lesson. We can talk about that after the lesson. But yes, there is a difference between those two things, right? But so the state of Milwaukee was not going to execute God's justice when it should have, because of modern sentiments and fluffy feelings about restorative justice and other things which are not justice in the first. But whenever you tend to tack on an adjective to justice, you're going to pop out the other side with something that's not justice, because justice doesn't need an adjective, you just do justice, right? When you come up with social justice, restorative justice, all these various different adjectival forms of justice, you're just changing what justice is. But anyway, so that's two things going on there. Let's go back to this. Let's go begin verse 13. For the promise to Abraham, or to his seed, that he would be the heir of the world, was not through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. For if those who are of the law are heirs, faith has been made empty, and the promise has been abolished. For the law brings about wrath, right, judgment, justice. But where there is no law, there is also no trespass, right? Speaking of lawlessness. For this reason, verse 16, it is by faith, in order that it may be accorded to grace, in other words, accounted, on the reason of grace. So faith coming about by grace is part of his point. He makes it elsewhere, especially really obviously in Ephesians 2. You have been justified by grace through faith, and that is not of yourself, in other words, the faith. It's the gift of God, lest anyone boasts, right? The very faith that we have is a gift from God, right? It is for this reason that by faith, in order that it may be accorded to grace, so that the promise will be guaranteed to all the seed, all the descendants, not only those who are of the law, Jews, but also to those who are of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. He's writing to Jewish and Roman Christians in Rome. Understand the context? To us all, Jews and Romans. As it is written, quote, a father of many nations, I have made you. Now I'll come back to that in a second. In the presence of him whom he delivered, even God, who gives life to the dead and calls into being that which does not exist, right? Raising from the dead, right? Spiritually, first and foremost, but also, as with Christ, materially. In hope, against hope, he believed, right? Pretty poetic. In hope, against hope, meaning having hope even amidst a hopeless situation, right? He and his wife in old age, beyond menopause, right? In hope, against hope, he believed. He trusted, he had faith. So that he might become a father of many nations, according to which he had been spoken, so shall be your seed. Or in other words, so shall your seed be. Same thing, right? There's two quotes there, the ending of verse 18 and the beginning of verse 17. As it is written, beginning of verse 17, a father of many nations have I made you. Now, it's going to be too difficult to kind of just flick through it. I'll give you what the references are specifically here, okay? Genesis 12, verse 3, Genesis 17 pardon me. Let me back up. These are all in Genesis, I should point out, by the way. These are all part of the story of Abraham and down to Joseph's days, right? So his grandson. Genesis 12:3, then chapter 17, verse 3 to 6, then chapter 18, verse 18, then chapter 22, verse 18, and then finally chapter 28, verse 14. Okay, so I'll read that again. 12:3, 17:3 to 6, 18:18, 22:18, and 28:14. Yeah? Those are the 5 times in which this phrase is repeated, okay? To Abraham, through, obviously, and then the final one in chapter 28 is to, well, Israel says it, but it's also in reference to Joseph and his sons Ephraim and Manasseh. So either way, Abraham and his immediate descendants, right? Isaac, Jacob, who's renamed Israel, and then Joseph, of course, and then Manasseh. So you got 5 generations by that time. But it begins in chapter 12, verse 3, which is the very beginning of the story of Abraham. Okay, so it's working its way through and repeating itself, blah, blah, blah. And it's that operative phrase, in you, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. 2 different words are used. So three out of those 5 times, 3 of them use the term nations. The first and the last one, so chapter 12, verse 3, as well as 28, verse 4, right? So in other words, the first and the last of them, there we go, use families. Okay? Ironically, we actually touched on this in last Sunday's sermon on Australia Day, right? Okay? And the notion of ancestry and family and everything else, right? Families and nations are used in this in the exact same phrase, using the 2 different words, which means they're being used synonymously, right? Nations are made up of families. There's an ancestral connection, right? We're not economic zones. They're not abstract jurisdictions under the UN. Families are actually specific things, okay? So when he says, in one case, through you, Abraham, and your descendants, especially particularly Christ, all the nations of the earth will be blessed, he's also saying, through you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Okay? Either way. That's that seminal phrase. So if I say families or nations, I'm using it interchangeably, right? In you or through you, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Keep in mind, the first time he says this is back in chapter 12, again, much like with chapter 15, prior to the circumcision, prior to the specific ritual element, right, that defined the old covenant, all that's prior, right? Here's why this is being quoted, and here's the important part you need to see and you need to understand, right? Because this is where we're going to be turning back to Galatians 3, right? Turn there with me now, right? Galatians 3, so that we can see this, because again, he's quoted it there in Romans 4, and this is why, to bridge us, now we've come full circle, right? This is the whole design of the lesson. From the believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness, connecting us to those verses in Genesis 15. Genesis 15 connects us to the quote in Romans 4, where he also uses the exact same quote that he now uses back here in Galatians, right? So it's full circle by design, right? Back in Galatians 3, right? I'll begin in verse 8. And the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify in this case, ethnoi, plural, so the nations or the Gentiles, I'll get back to a semantic point on that in a second, by faith, proclaimed the gospel beforehand to Abraham. So the gospel's not just some New Testament thing. The gospel's been there since Abraham. It's really actually been there since Adam in Genesis 3, because the whole notion of seed and descendant and everything else in between, and the gospel, right, goes back to, I will bless the seed of the woman, and you will have enmity against the seed of the serpent. So this whole notion of descendants goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. But either way, in this case, he's highlighting one of those kind of foundational points, right? Proclaimed the gospel before him to Abraham, saying, quote, all the nations will be blessed in you. That's the exact same phrase, just from the Greek, right? Through you, or in you, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. All the nations will be blessed in you, right? So he's quoting all those 5 different parts of Genesis that I rattled off earlier. Following? Same as what he was then, in essence, kind of directly quoting as well in regards to Romans, right? A father of many nations I have made you, okay? In this particular respect. In you all the nations of the earth will be blessed. So then those who are of faith are blessed with Abraham the believer. I'll come back to that as well in a second, okay? So let me deal with the first thing. The semantics of nations or Gentiles. These words are used, like with any word ever, but these words, like everything else, are always in a context. The word Gentile comes from the Roman gentili or gentilium, various different iterations, meaning a foreigner, okay? So to a Roman, everyone who was not a Roman was a Gentile in that respect, you understand? To a Jew, everyone who was not a Jew was a Gentile. It's not even a derogatory thing, it's just a delineation. People who are not us, okay? We just use the term foreigner. Well, who's a foreigner to an Australian? Well, everyone who's not an Australian.
Yeah.
It doesn't, that's fine, that's just language, right? There doesn't need to be any kind of connotation, positive or negative. It's a fairly neutral thing. It's just a categorical description. Australians and everyone who's not an Australian. Ta-da, right? This is the context of the word, and that has also been the case in the history of the English language as well. I mean, I could probably use a couple of different examples, but at least one that would come to my head off the top right now would be the Recessional from Rudyard Kipling. We're familiar with that usually when it's used on Anzac Day, right? God of our fathers known of old, Lord of our far-flung battle lines, beneath whose awesome hand we hold dominion over palm and pine. Lord God of hosts, be with us yet, lest we forget. The captains and the kings depart. The tumult and the shouting dies. Still stands thy sacrifice of a humble and a contrite heart. Lord God of hosts, be with us yet, etc., etc. That particular poem, and the last stanza of it, because I think it's about 4 or 5 stanzas off memory, finishes with, has in it a phrase, again, the nature of that poem, without giving you an entire TED talk on Kipling's writings. The Recessional was written in 1897 for the Diamond Jubilee of the Queen Empress Victoria, okay? Expecting that he would write a grand, kind of exuberant work, like of course many of the great British classics like Rule Britannia and other such works. He writes a rather somber, almost quasi-prophetic, especially this coming 15 years prior to World War I and the disasters that we've been suffering ever since. He writes a very humble and somber work, calling on God to have mercy on us and reminding us as the British people in that context to not become jingoistic and prideful in our imperial might. Right? That's the context in which he's writing. He makes a reference in the last stanza to the boasting that the Gentiles use, or lesser breeds without the law. The lesser breeds, ironically, is actually the Germans. that's actually in view. It's not Africans, it's not the Indians, it's not the Maori or the Aborigines. It's actually the Germans are the lesser breeds who he's referring to. But anyway, because of the tensions that were existing.
So we're going to sing that verse now.
Yeah.
Well, because it gets confused, it automatically. Well, that's how dumb this stuff is now. The woke stuff is because immediately when everyone reads it, they assume he's got to be talking about like Nigerians or something.
Yeah.
No, he's not. He's talking about the Germans.
The weird thing with Victoria, she had so many kids. The first half of them were all married off to Germans, but then
Well, they were German.
They were.
The House of Hanover.
They married, but then later on,
She married a German.
She wasn't married. Yeah, she did, but later on, the younger ones were married off to. You could see the mood changing.
Oh, there's a shift. Yeah. Well, all of that. Well, she marries Albert of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Of course, that then becomes the dynasty when, with the accession of Edward VII, and so then they, of course, once he passes away, and then George V ascends to the throne in 1910, the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha is now at war with Germany, and the Germans aren't really in vogue anymore, and so that's when the change comes to the House of Windsor. Yeah. Anyway, point I'm making is this, right? Point I'm making is this: he uses that phrase. Such boasting as the Gentiles use. Kipling's not Jewish.
No.
The English are not Jewish. The Welsh, the Scottish, the Irish, the Manx, the Cornish, whatever. They're not Jews. Why is he using the term Gentile? Well, he's using the term Gentile the way that the term Gentile has always been used forever until very, very recently. Okay? A Gentile is just someone, again, from that Roman, it's not even a Hebrew term. It's a Latin term, right? It's why we also get this adjective or it kind of functions as a verb sometimes. But anyway, of something being genteel. Okay, genteel sensibilities, and again, this whole context of what that means. But Gentile just means a foreigner, someone from another land, another people who are not us, right? To everyone else who was not a Roman, they were Gentiles, right? To Paul and to his fellow Jews, everyone else was a Gentile. He's just using a Latin term, obviously, because it's the days of the Roman Empire. Do you know what I mean? An Indian is a Gentile to me. I don't mean me personally, but I mean like me, an Australian, right? Do you know what I mean? That's what the context is. So, what happens though is, I'm just being brutally honest, because of influences of modern Zionism in whatever different form, the theology of that term has shifted, where we think of it in a binary categorization, that the person who's not a Jew is the Gentile. Does that make sense? Because we're misunderstanding the context of how these words get used. So it's not like Paul's using the word incorrectly. No, he's using it 100% correctly, right? It's like later on, he uses a different phrase to describe the exact same concept when he says, in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek. Okay? So he's using, obviously, the major people group in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Greeks, okay? And as well as the people of the lingua franca of the world, or in this case, I suppose, the lingua hellenica, the Greek language, not the French language, but the language of the world, right? The common tongue of international trade and of the empire and everything else, etc. This is part and parcel of my point, because I don't want to make it later on, because we've got so much to focus on in those verses. I don't want to get caught up in a discussion about the word Gentile. I want to do it here. Some English translations bring that phrase in verse 28, Jew or Greek, into English as Jew or Gentile. Okay, he doesn't use that. He says Judaion, Kai Chelin, or Chelinoi in this case, plural, Greek. Right? Jew and Greek. He doesn't say Gentile, because he's not using Greek as the only example, right? He's just using Greek as a stand-in, okay? Because it's not like verse 28 only applies to the Jew and the Greek, but the Romans tough out of luck. Do you know what I mean? Or the Celt, or the Egyptian, or various other peoples around these times, the Persians, etc., right? Who would become Christians at various different points. Do you know what I mean? He's just using the Greeks as an obvious stand-in, because that's who culturally predominate. That's the cultural predominant. Yeah, exactly. Do you know what I mean? Right? So that's a very important distinction. I really need you to understand that, right? Apart from it being a technical mistranslation, it actually completely changes the theology of the verse when it's brought into English as Gentile. That's not the point he's making, right? Greek is used as a stand-in for any and all peoples around whatever, the Romans, like I said, the Romans, Egyptians, the Celts, etc., right? He uses Gentile elsewhere because he's a Jew. So to everyone who's not a Jew, they're a Gentile. Just like he is a Gentile to the Romans that he writes to in the book of Romans. Do you know what I mean? He's the Gentile. Okay? So Gentile is not some universal category that exists in a binary that's directly impinged or related to Jews at any time. Back then, now, it doesn't matter what, right? Even to be more blunt and obvious, it certainly isn't the case now, because it wasn't the case back then, right? So the term Gentile has never, ever existed in a set binary between Jew and everyone who's not a Jew. That's never been what that word meant, ever. Do you understand what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I'm not a Gentile.
No.
Everyone who's not an Australian is a Gentile to me.
Yeah.
Right?
But we're a Gentile to a Russian.
Right, correct, yeah. I'm a Gentile to a Russian, or I'm a Gentile to an Indian. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right? If we're just using these terms. Now again, the term's fallen out. We have another term, foreigner, right? Which is via French, of course, right? So foreigner is just essentially the modern equivalent that we use for that, right? I'm a foreigner. Again, see, if we use the term foreigner, it all of a sudden becomes
Makes sense.
completely clear, right? So if I said here, or if I pretended that Paul said here, and the scripture foreseeing that God would justify the foreigners by faith, because he's speaking as a Jew, now it's clear, it's super clear, everyone knows what he's talking about now,
Yeah.
right? But because of the influences of certain politico-religious ideologies of the last 150 years,
Yes.
we've actually completely changed the meaning. It never meant that. No one ever understood it that way. The Apostle Paul, thousands of years ago, in the actual context in which that word is being used normally on the regular,
Yeah.
isn't even using it that way. So ideology has completely shifted how we understand this
It's not
word.
specific to the Jews.
No.
It is relationally, but just like everyone
It's
else.
not the only thing.
Just like everyone else. So it's totally, again, how many times have I ever harped on about context and context. History, right? And people wonder why I belabor so hard. It's because of these things, right? Do you understand? It's because of these things, right? So he's using this term in context perfectly appropriately, because everyone who's not a Jew to him, which includes the Galatian Celts, we already spoke about that context when we, at the very beginning of this series, right? About who the Galatians were, they're Celts, right? In this kind of very weird pocket diaspora, heavily Hellenized, heavily intermarried, right? So kind of, in this case, Celto-Greek, functionally speaking, Celto-Hellenic, right? But either way, Celtic nonetheless, right? These Galatians are Gentiles to him, especially as he's talking about in regards to Abraham, because keep in mind, Abraham's been the central focus, right?
Yeah.
So these guys are not physical descendants, strictly speaking, of Abraham, at least not obviously like Paul is, right? Who's writing the letter, right? Who's from the tribe of Benjamin. They are descendants of him by faith, though. They are descendants of Abraham by faith, because that's what he's saying, right? That's why,
So
yeah.
the word, the term Gentile,
Mhm.
it's not whether you are in the faith or not.
No, it's just a historical ethnic thing. It's an ethnic. It's like it's functionally speaking. Again, there is a minor semantic difference, but that's just by virtue of history. By every normal functional, or in every normal functional sense, the term Gentile is just the word that we use today, foreigner. That's fundamentally what it is, right? So the foreigners, right? He's also saying, in this particular case, verse 8, and the scripture foreseeing that God would justify, in other words, make righteous, right? Justify, righteous, synonyms, would justify the foreigners by faith.
Yeah.
Not just us, but also the foreigners by faith. Okay? Hence why he then finishes, obviously having said that all the nations will be blessed in you, so the foreigners, right? Not just one nation, but all the nations. Okay? So then those who are of faith, this is verse 9 that we're finishing on here, so then those who are of faith are blessed with Abraham the believer. Kata alongside. Right? They stand with Abraham. They're on Abraham's team, to speak colloquially. Right? Those who are of faith are blessed with Abraham. They are the fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham. In this case, keep in mind, the Apostle Paul is as far removed in history from Abraham as we are from Paul. Okay, so Paul is 2,000 years later on. He's speaking about ancient times.
Doesn't Jesus say something about these stones can be turned into God can?
Yeah, well, he's making he's harkening back to, he's making reference to, he's making a reference to the book of Ezekiel and things that happen in the book of Ezekiel during the beginning of the Babylonian conquest. So he's referencing things, 600 years prior to him. But his point is that, again, well, in that context, it's a very similar thing. He's talking to a number of the Jewish Pharisees and Sadducees and other of the priests, and they're basically making the point to him that, well, we're the chosen ones because we're the Jews after all. Yeah, we're the children of Abraham. Yeah. Yeah, they mean like ethnically, or the children of Abraham, the descendants of Abraham. And he says that I can make even. He's basically making a point to them that as to their complete lack of understanding of the scriptures, to thinking that that's what actually matters. He says I can even make these stones. I can make these stones cry out and worship God properly. right? Because I am God. That's his point. But either way, right? I could raise these stones up to. Again, it's referencing a similar phrase in the book of Ezekiel. But either way, yeah, the same Ezekiel who everyone ignored and didn't listen to, just like they did Jesus. So, yeah. So those who are of the faith are blessed with Abraham the believer. Abraham the believing one would be a literal way, but much cleaner in English to say the believer. Abraham is the one who had faith. He is the faithful one. He is the believer. And all those who also have faith in the same God that Abraham did, which is what we are as Christians, right? That's what a Christian is. Just even to make a very brief point, there is no such thing as the Abrahamic religions, plural. There is one Abrahamic religion, okay, and that's called Christianity. Judaism is not Abrahamic. Islam is not Abrahamic. Right? To reject God is to reject the God of Abraham, by definition. And if you reject the God of Abraham, you're not part of verse 9. Right? Like, that'd be obvious. That shouldn't be rocket science. That's just a very Socratic way of reasoning, right? Those who are of faith in God, who trust God, who believe God, are blessed with Abraham. There's one Abrahamic faith. Okay? That's what it is. And it didn't come from the nomadic tribes of Arabia, nor did it come from Pharisees and Sadducees who brought back Babylon with them. That's what it is. Right? There's one Abrahamic faith, and that's us. Everyone who is not in allegiance to Jesus Christ, who is the descendant and the fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham, is not with Abraham. It's not complex. It's very straightforward. You are with me or you are against me, says Jesus. That's it. You're with me or you're against me. Right?
Yeah, and this is why the Jews hated Paul, because he was just...
Oh, of course, yeah.
This would be just so foreign to them, like that just...
Yeah, ironically, pardon the pun. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so, yeah, sure. You're very gentle. But see, all it is, though, is because... But the problem is that and this is the difficulty, is that the Apostle Paul is, apart from being smarter than them, again, plenty of other smart people during his time, right?
Yeah.
But he's more educated. This is the difficulty. And again, God obviously uses the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. He says that quite often, right? Where he uses foolish things that are that don't seem to have this kind of major impact on things. But the point that's being made here is that he also at times actually uses things that are difficult to defeat, right? So we've talked a bit about Paul, of course. We talk more about him actually in the book of Acts for those who've watched that Bible study. But in this case, the Apostle Paul was the preeminent Pharisaical student and scholar of his time. There was another one who was also very prominent alongside of him. He actually went on to become pretty influential in establishing what would go on to become the basis of the Talmud. But anyway, that's another story. But so the other Pharisees and Sadducees, or even local Jewish rabbis in XYZ city in Galatia here, can't match Paul. That's the problem. So it'd be even more frustrating because he knows the scriptures better than them and he understands them. But without being smart, that's also why he gets it right. So like it's a bit of it's not like it's a negative thing. It's kind of, no, he actually just literally understands the scriptures better.
Yeah.
And that's not the reason. Again, he gets this by the grace of God. I'm not discounting that, right? But again, like we even talked about other times earlier, this is not an esoteric religion. We don't just believe God just does these things just kind of willy-nilly. No, he works through material means and always has. That's why he created the universe. He educated Paul, he raised Paul up, even when Paul was the chief enemy of the church, when he was running death squads, when he was martyring all of us, right? And he then redeems him, saves him, changes him, and makes him his chief, and turns him from the chief enemy of the church to the chief apostle, chief evangelist, effectively, of the church, right? That's why. And so he knows the scriptures better than them. He believes the scriptures more importantly, because again, knowledge is one thing, and knowledge is not important. Knowledge is, of course, vital, but much akin to what I talked about even in passing on Sunday. What goes on up here is one thing. What goes on in here is another thing altogether. Right? Yeah.
Can I just ask a question? When you referred to verse 28, I didn't quite get that.
Of where? Of Galatians 3.
Of Galatians, where it says there is neither Jew nor Greek.
Yeah.
You said. I didn't quite get what you meant by.
So what my point was, I was making a point about the semantics of the term Gentile, right? What I was specifically making a point on in regards to verse 28 is that the term Greek is used, okay, in plural, or in this case, kind of the proper noun sense, but Greek, a Greek, or the Greeks. The term for Gentile specifically, the word that gets used back up in verse, whatever it is at the top there, verse 8, is not used, right? He says Jew and he says Greek, right? So he says Judaion and he says Hellenes, right, Greek. The point I was making was about our understanding of what the word Gentile means. So what I was specifically referencing when I came on to this point was that because of modern ideologies, our understanding of what Gentile means there's been a shift in a number of churches in regards to what that term means, where the term is an explicitly biblical term that's attached in a binary with the term Jew. Yeah. Okay, so that Gentile in certain sections of modern Christianity has come to mean anyone who's not a Jew.
Yeah.
Okay? So the Roman is by nature a Gentile.
Yeah.
Or the Greek by nature a Gentile, the Celt by nature a Gentile, the Egyptian, whatever.
Yeah. I understood that, but were you saying like that where it says Jew or Greek, that's not, is that why specifically Greek? Yeah, so that's how I was then connecting it with what I was saying was that Greek here is being used as a stand-in for
Everybody else.
Yeah, for everyone else, right? Because they are the predominant people of the Eastern Mediterranean world, right?
Yeah.
Greek culture is the culture of the world. Again, obviously it's Greco-Roman as we call it, but Roman is born out of and built from Greek culture, Hellenistic culture.
But you can't use this, it's not interchangeable in terms of daily use. Would it be? It's only because of the situation he's in.
Because of the context.
He's preaching to most people.
Right.
Greek, so.
And so the point I was making was that yes, and so the point that was being made on top of that was that because of the theological shift in regards to the understanding of Gentile, not maliciously, I'm not attributing malice, it's not malicious at all, it's just erroneous, right? So there's a difference. Certain translations, I think maybe even the NIV does it, I'd have to look specifically.
The problem is that it is now.
Yep.
Now time.
Yep.
A negative.
There are contextual ways in which it can be used negative, yeah. There are ways in which it can be that.
Because of misusing the Jews in context, in relation to the Gentiles. It's not...
Correct. He's not using either of these terms negatively,
not there,
right? And so,
it's confusing because now...
That's what I said, yeah.
Oh, yes, it's being used, yes.
You know,
Yes, it's become loaded politically and ideologically, right? So the point I'm trying to draw is that, and again, so this should be a thing that Christians should just in a general sense agree on, right? Regardless of anything else. The eschatological views shouldn't actually really impact this at all. We unfortunately allow various things to get in the way. It's just basic facts, right? It's language, it's linguistics, that's what it is, right? Greek is being used as a stand-in. So some English translators have chosen to bring that term in as Gentile for the theological or the ideological reason, not the literary one, right? It's why we have to be, again, there are positives to the modern flourishing of English translation, well, translations generally, right? We live in an age, because of the age of the internet and of modern technology, post-industrial revolution, the Bible, the Word of God and the Bible has been able to spread far greater than it ever has before, right? Thumbs up. It's been able to be translated into more languages than we ever could have possibly conceived prior. Thumbs up.
Yeah.
What can get printed in? I mean, what can get printed in a month outpaces what the Gutenberg printing press could do in years. Thumbs up, right? Plenty of positives. The negatives, though, have been
agendas.
Commercialization and agenda. Yeah, correct. Right. So commercialization and agenda, right? Coming out with new translations because publishing houses can make money, big problem. Coming out, and as a result of that, you might go, oh well, that's one thing. But if we're just printing more Bibles, who cares if we're making? Who cares if it's done for commercial reasons? Because the Bible gets printed more, right? The problem is that in the commercial age, you've got to now name the Bible, and you've got to name the Bible, and the translation that is, and you've got to have something that delineates it, because otherwise, why are they going to buy that one, not anything they ever bought before? So now you're incentivized to do something, even that's just slightly different. Doesn't mean they always do that, but I'm saying the incentive rears its head, and that's the problem, right? Human beings work on incentives, always have. It's part of our fallen nature, right? A woman in primordial times was incentivized to do something she shouldn't, and it sent the world into a tailspin. Okay, her name was Eve. Right? That's the problem. Okay, incentives. It's always incentives. That's how you manipulate things. People can be incentivized to do good. People can also be incentivized to do evil. Right. So either way, my point here is that there are certain English translations that will bring that term. Go away. Bring the term in verse 28 into English as Gentile, even though the word specifically is Greek. The problem with it is the fact that they're not doing it maliciously. It's not a willfully malicious, subversive thing on the part of the translation committee that's doing it. Right? I'm not saying that. Right? Apart from the fact that that would require an act of clairvoyance. The point, more broadly though, the point is that what's being done. Yeah. So again, NIV, which is at this particular point, I mean, if you did, well, the King James Version's been around for 400 years, so it's got a long head start. But if you talk about the modern translations, the two most popular by far are the English Standard Version, the ESV, on the whole a great translation, and the NIV, which if you're stuck on a desert island would be perfectly fine. If you have other
I got one. That was my first.
If you have other, if you have
Actually, good news was my
if you have other options, don't go with the NIV, right?
I don't look at mine.
Sure, right? So NIV, which as I said is up there alongside the ESV as the most popular English translation in the world. And I don't know if it would outpace the ESV, they'd probably be neck and neck. Translates as Gentile. Okay.
Oh, okay. I've got one.
Right. So this is my point. Right. This is exactly what I was saying. I was pretty sure off the top of my head that it did. I just wanted to confirm that, and it has.
Yeah.
Right. Now, is it because the translation committee of the NIV is purposely trying to corrupt the Christian faith? No. Is it because they are foreign agents working for intelligence organizations? No. It's because of, not literally an unconscious, but it's because of the shift that's occurred in broader Christian culture, particularly North America, which is where these translations by and large come from. Again, which is not a problem. A shift ideologically, politically, religiously, etc. So, it's theologically that's occurred, where these terms have shifted in meaning, right? From away from what they ever originally meant, which is a problem. Of course, language always evolves, right? The further back you go in the English language, the more difficult you're going to have over time. You're going to have in ever reading anything, especially by the time you get to Old English, where you won't be able to make heads and tails of it if you haven't studied it, right? So language evolves, and language is always continuously evolving, but not when it's done in a way that's detrimental. That's the problem. So when you have shifts in the semantic range or the semantic domain of words that occurs for ideological reasons, political reasons, theological, whatever, you then end up missing the point of what those words could originally mean, right? You can maybe argue in certain contexts that shifting of words is fine, because we have that all the time, right? I highly doubt that, and again, I could probably pick 1,000 different words here, but I highly doubt that any of you have ever heard the word doom used to mean the word law.
No, doomsday book.
The what? The word
Doom, D-O-O-M, impending doom, meaning something as simple as the word law. L-A-W,
So is that where the
law.
doomsday book comes from? Is that kind of because it's a law? Is it to do with law?
So if you ever read the history of Alfred the Great and his famous doom book, and you would think it's some apocalyptic novel, and you know he wrote it so that it could
Yeah.
spawn a movie series or something. No.
Same with awful. Awful never.
Correct. Yeah, so plenty of times again, if you read any medieval translations of the scriptures or early English translations, God is described as awful. Awful means full of awe. That's what that word means, okay? Worship is a word that's also shifted, where again, early on, certainly in Middle English, the term worship, which is mainly where that influence comes from via Anglo-Norman, the word worship means something much more broader in Middle English than it does in contemporary English. We think of worship specifically in regards to that which is attributed to God. And then what happens is you read about, you read something in Middle English from historical documents from, of King Richard the Lionheart being worshipped by his troops, and you freak out thinking that these Christians were committing idolatry because they worship that. No. Worship meaning honour. Right? So there are still plenty of positions even in both ecclesiastical and civil contexts, especially in regards to certain ceremonial roles in which the person is not described as your honour or your grace, but as your worshipfulness or as your worship. Your worship, Lord, blah, blah, blah. Right? Of the house or whatever, right? Honour. Okay, so it's shifted again. That can happen. There's a natural evolution of how language works. The thing is, though, you just got to understand the differences. So that worship is actually a really good example of what I'm talking about, right? When you read of a king being worshipped by his people, or you read of a person being described as in a titular form, as an honorary title, your worship, like your grace or my Lord, whatever. Even the term Lord. My Lord, right? Any medieval show or movie, whatever you've ever watched, my Lord, blah, 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 blah. And we think that, and again, in our post-Enlightenment, egalitarian modern world, we think of that as just wild, right? Yeah, exactly. And so and so it's especially, especially in contexts that have had their own Enlightenment revolutions, like France or America or elsewhere, and hearing the term Lord being used, it's utterly foreign, right?
It's like feudalistic.
Yeah, it seems almost exactly. It seems like medieval and feudalistic and whatever, blah blah blah. But again, the term Lord is just means the one. Again, it's ultimately deriving more broadly earlier on. It's an again Norman influence, like a lot of English was in the medieval period, but it's ultimately coming from the Latin word dominus. Okay, a lord, one who, which also we get the English word dominate, right? Dominus, dominate. One who is above. That's all it is. Yeah, exactly. Right. So the Lord God is above us. So that's why the term Lord gets used. Right. Now, Lord also has a divine context in the ancient world in certain contexts, but Abraham is described as a Lord. Sarah calls Abraham my Lord.
Yeah.
It's a husband. Now, again, modern egalitarian feminist sensibilities make us freak out, right? Right.
Oh, well, we won't go down that.
Right. Right. And so, but that's the thing, though.
Yeah,
It's a failure to understand what these terms mean.
That's right.
Right? And again, those terms have been used until extremely recently. So even that term Lord has shifted because of ideology.
Yeah,
It's the same thing.
That's right, yeah.
Right? It's shifted because of ideology.
Yeah.
Because in medieval times, the wives would always call that, wouldn't they? My Lord.
The husband was a lord. Obviously, your actual literal noble lord, feudal lord, was a lord as well. Right? It wasn't some. Again, it was just basic elements of courtesy and rhetoric that have been around literally forever. Yeah, the Lord of the Manor, 100%. Even today, again, we still have maintained we've maintained these English traditions even here.
Yeah.
What is Clover Moor? The Lord Mayor of Sydney.
Yeah.
Each of the cities, each of the metropolitans of the states have a Lord Mayor. Okay, especially in the East Coast. Right? I think Adelaide's is a different name, but I need to check that. Either way. Lord Mayor of Sydney, Lord Mayor of Brisbane, Lord Mayor of Melbourne, right? That's all those are, right? So anyway, that's shifted because of ideology. Much as in this particular case with this word Gentile, it's a shift because of ideology, right? Now, Do we need to bring the word Lord back in a broader context? Not particularly, but that's that's a more irrelevant discussion. The problem, though, is that we're not dealing with... That's a more civic, social issue. That's one thing. This is impacting theology. That's the problem.
Yeah.
Do you understand what I mean? It's more significant, right? So worship can have that impact as well. Again, we shouldn't condemn our medieval ancestors for referring to certain ecclesiastical positions as your worship, because to fail to understand what that term meant at that time. Okay. Likewise with this, we've got to be careful with how we use the word Gentile. A Gentile is not, by nature, a non-Jew. A Gentile is a foreigner.
Something dirty or lesser.
Let alone negative. Yeah, exactly. The term Gentile has never had a negative context. Only through. Obviously, yes, there is a. Depending on what you're talking about, there is a negative context, right? So to the Romans, the Gentiles, that is a negative term to the Romans because, of course, they're not Romans, so they can't be that great, right? Right. So they're the barbarians. But again, even that term of the barbarians is borrowed from the Greeks, right? It's an onomatopoeic term. Barbar, those who babble, right?
That's my husband.
Barbaros, right? Yeah,
He's a baba.
sure. But the barbaroi, right, or varvaroi in the Greek, the foreign tongue. Those are the foreigners. Those who babble,
Yeah.
right? Those who make weird sounds that are not Greek.
Sound.
Those who don't speak the greatest language of earth, which is Greek. Yeah, exactly. Are the barbarians, right? So in that case, it's a specific. There's a kind of tongue-in-cheek derogatory aspect of the term barbarian, right? Yeah, and so that's where that kind of context comes in, right? Gentilium is more or less the equivalent of varvaroi or barbaroi, right? Barbarian. It's a foreigner. It's the foreign tongue. So yes, the Romans will view that as a negative thing, but it doesn't have to explicitly be a negative thing, right? So people groups can attribute a negative connotation to it. Huh?
Is it the Vandals?
Well, the Vandals are one of the Germanic peoples, yeah, and by virtue of the way that they barnstormed their way across Hispania,
Vandals.
the term in English, Vandals, ended up getting attributed to that coming out of the Renaissance because of how much destruction the Vandals caused, particularly to Hispania and North Africa, where they eventually settled in North Africa, right? Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria. And so to vandalize something is to destroy into whatever else. Right. And now they're reduced to tagging trains in the middle of the night. Yeah, it's a big step down. They used to rule an entire kingdom in North Africa, and now the Vandals get high marijuana and graffiti trains.
Yes.
But anyway, the point is that these words have meaning. So the Romans 100% use the term Gentile with a negative attribution. But that's, as the word suggests, an attribute. It's attributed to it. It's not inherent, right? It's just a category, foreigner. Varvaroi has that negative barbarian, did have a negative attribution, but by attribution. With the Jews, the actual Hebrew word, goy or goyim, plural, the nations, the people, the foreigners, had a negative attribution. But as an attribution, right, it doesn't inherently have to by nature, right? It's not inherent in the semantic word. It's in the semantics of the word itself, sorry, right? It just means a foreigner. So I can use the term foreigner in a perfectly neutral sense. You can also, via either the context of the rest of the sentence or by tone or by inflection, use the term foreigner negatively, right? So there's a context to how that word gets used. Do you know what I mean? Like with anything else, again, language is more than just the written word. There's all kinds of things from tonality to inflection. There's everything else, right? So it doesn't. But the point I'm trying to draw is it doesn't inherently negative. But even that though is secondary to the core point on the word Gentile. A Gentile is not inextricably linked by nature to the word Jew or Jewish, right? It means a foreigner relevant to any other person or people group you want to insert. A Roman and anyone who's not a Roman. A Greek and anyone who's not Greek. An Australian and anyone who's not Australian. That's it. It's so vital you understand that.
It's just subjective, like it's kind of like...
It is literally subjective. It's what we would call relative. It's subjectively relative, yeah. or relatively subjective, by the way. That's the point that's being drawn here. So the nations, or Gentiles, by faith is what the phrase is in verse 8 of that passage that we looked at today. All right? Those who are of the faith, from Abraham all the way down to us, by faith. We are justified, in other words, made righteous before God by faith. It doesn't come about as a result of the circumcision, vis-a-vis his point in chapter 4 of the book of Romans, okay, which we've linked to this, right? We've gone full circle because of those two quotes. That's the whole connection. The incorporation, or the gospel going forth, the gospel being salvation by the grace of God through Jesus Christ, received by faith, right, has gone forth to the nations in fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham, that through you all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. You will become the father of many nations. From you many kings shall arise. All these various other things which we haven't touched on because we take too long, that Abraham was promised, right? Your descendants shall be as innumerable as the stars in the heavens and as the sands upon the seashore. Okay? Ta-da. People who are on Team Abraham are so by faith. Anyone who's not by faith has nothing to do with Abraham.